Power creep can feel like a looming risk in any long-running game, but in a gacha like Genshin, it's even more of a concern. Some would even argue it's inevitable. Many people invest a lot of time and money into their accounts, and the prospect of seeing their hard-earned characters fall by the wayside can be worrying. While many are content to play the game on their own terms and are happy to disregard the most difficult content, anyone who tries to keep up with the abyss has to keep this possibility in mind. While Hoyo has managed to avoid much power creep so far, in many games it ramps up over time, and the release of Neuvillette made me start to ask the question, are we going to start seeing power creep in Genshin? So that we're on the same page, let's first set out what exactly power creep is. I tend to think of it as taking two main forms, direct and ambient. Direct power creep is when a new character fulfills the same role as an older one and is objectively better in that role. A well-designed combat system can make it possible to avoid this for the most part, and when it does happen, it can be less of a problem than it might seem at first glance. Ambient power creep is a bigger problem. Endgame content tends to get more difficult over time, since that's the only way to consistently provide a challenge for long-term players. Older characters start to fall behind, and eventually teams built around them are no longer viable when aiming to complete the hardest content. Even if a game avoids direct power creep and characters tend to remain unique in their respective roles, ambient power creep can still be hard to avoid. Both of these are particularly hard to judge in Genshin because there's such a variance in the level of investment each player makes into any given character. The diversity of how much people prioritize each character, what constellations they aim for, what weapons they have available, how lucky they have been in the many layers of artifact RNG, all these things add up. Either way, the business model of any gacha game relies on people pulling for new characters. The easiest way for the developers to incentivize spending is a combination of both types of power creep, so even if it hasn't happened in the past, it's always a risk. For me, the release of Neuvillette started setting off those alarm bells, especially when comparing him to Ayato. In the Hydro main DPS role, which Ayato is tailored for, my Neuvillette is already stronger despite having less investment than my Ayato. He hits harder, his range is larger, he hits more often, and his rotations are smoother. In terms of power, there's now really no situation where I would bring Ayato out instead of Neuvillette, aside from the times I just want some variety or maybe some slight support capability. Ayato was never a crowd favourite in terms of power in the first place, but to see him become so clearly outclassed in his own area is undeniably sad. This feels like a textbook example of direct power creep, which made me want to look a little more carefully into how Hoyo has been dealing with it so far, and see if we can get a feel for whether we might start seeing this happen more often in the future. The worry, of course, is that if direct power creep starts happening more often, then ambient power creep is far more likely to happen. Let's look at the strategies Hoyo has used to avoid this up to now, touch on reverse power creep, and then speculate what the future might hold. 3 years worth of new characters gives us a lot of insight into how Hoyo have managed this so far. Most new characters fill new niches by combining an existing role with a new element or a unique facet, by providing new nuances on the same combination, or by creating a new role entirely. For example, let's look at how they've handled different shielders. The main differentiator for pure shielders is that their shield uses a different element. The playstyles of characters like Zhongli, Thoma, Layla, Kirara, and arguably Beidou too tends to be fairly similar, with only minor variations in how their shields function. While Zhongli hands down has the strongest shield, the others remain highly usable due to providing different elements and therefore enabling different reactions and resonances. They could easily add a similar character each for Anemo and Hydro, and the new characters would open up new niche and unlock new teams without affecting how usable the other pure shielders are. And it's not just elements which make a huge difference. Both Layla and Diona provide a cryo shield, but they're very different characters. Layla's shield is far stronger, since it's her main focus, though she also does apply a small amount of cryo. Diona, on the other hand, also provides healing, cryo application, and other support utilities at higher constellations. Despite them both being cryo shielders, they fulfill very different roles overall and result in very different team compositions. Going even further, Hoyo has a great track record of coming up with new takes on existing mechanics in Genshin which provide unexpected benefits. Baizu's shield is very unique. While other shields have large HP pools and provide solid protection until they're broken, his shield is very weak but refreshes every couple of seconds. This sounded very underwhelming in theory, but in practice it's brilliant for a lot of characters who need interruption resistance over a longer period of time and benefit from consistent Dendro application. This level of creativity in how characters work means that the potential for unique niches is much greater than it might seem at first. Even when multiple characters with the same element focus primarily on the same role, they still tend to be tailored to different team compositions. The best example of this is the Anemo support and crowd control role. There are currently 3 characters who focus on this role: Venti, Kazuha, and Sucrose. It would have been easy for these 3 to be completely interchangeable, but there's enough differentiation within their niche for them to provide different strengths, which leads them each to be more suited to different types of team. Venti has the most powerful crowd control, but also helps restore energy to your team, making him more valuable in particularly energy-hungry teams. Kazuha provides an elemental damage boost, which is extremely sought after in teams focusing on additive or amplifying reactions and is essential for enabling mono-elemental teams. Sucrose provides an elemental mastery buff, which is brilliant in transformative reaction teams. I have all 3 and I use both Kazuha and Sucrose regularly. Venti is great, but my builds tend to have enough energy recharge that his take on the role is less valuable to my teams. All 3 have their place though, despite how much their intended roles overlap. A couple of other notable examples of this are Hu Tao versus Yoimiya, where Yoi has a lower damage ceiling but can be more comfortable to use, while also being more effective against certain types of enemies, or Fischl and Yamiko, where the difference tends to be more down to smaller details like how the team rotation lines up or how the main DPS attack style works with the off-field Electro applier. Genshin's combat system has enough complexity that even in a seemingly straightforward role, there's enough nuance to allow for multiple viable characters to share the same space. For the most part, the closest thing to direct power creep that we've seen so far in Genshin is when a 5-star character fills the same role as a 4-star one. It's expected for a 5-star to be more powerful, but in the few cases where it's happened, it hasn't really been an issue. Yelan and Xingqiu is the prime example of this, with both characters having a very similar kit. As before, there are nuances which make Xingqiu more suited to some teams. For example, his pseudo shield and healing can be very useful, but looking at the damage they each provide as a sub DPS, Yelan comes out far ahead. Despite this, Xingqiu remains relevant. He's still a fantastic sub DPS who is central to many teams, and it's pretty common for people to use him on one side of the abyss while Yelan's busy on the other. There are also some extremely powerful teams which use both Yelan and Xingqiu to great effect. The few cases where a character has more or less become obsolete are when their playstyle is just too clunky compared to newer characters, or when they have been outpaced on quality of life rather than raw strength. Please a good example of someone being left behind due to their clunkier playstyle. She's quite powerful, but to get the most out of her it takes a lot of effort, and even then she's at best only equal to others such as Hu Tao, Yoimiya, Lini or Yanfei. Since the others offer a much smoother experience, Klee tends to not see as much usage as she did originally. Gigi is the perfect example of someone outpaced due to quality of life. She's an absolutely fantastic healer, but is much too heavily focused on healing for her to feel at all useful. She applies very little cryo and has high energy requirements and does not generate energy at all, so even though she has not been power crept directly in terms of healing, she's largely obsolete because all the other healers have something else they bring to the team, while providing enough healing to keep you alive. Thankfully, these kinds of issues have been the exception rather than the norm so far, and it's far more common for older characters to be given a new lease on life when new characters or mechanics are added which synergize well. The one place where power creep seems to be consistently marching on is in the strength of constellations for limited 5-star characters. Many early 5-stars had merely decent constellations which just built on top of their C0 kit and either added some extra utility or some useful bonuses, though Hu Tao's C1 was an early one which did make a huge difference to her kit. Over time, the strength increases provided by these constellations has noticeably grown, to the point where the numbers for the recent C6 5-stars just look absurd. Ultimately, the power creep in this area doesn't really matter as long as the C0 versions are kept viable. If anything, most people who have those constellations likely end up finding the game a bit boring, and they almost have to do abyss runs with one character on each side just to keep themselves entertained. So Hoyo has done a pretty good job of avoiding direct power creep, and as a result ambient power creep hasn't been a big issue. However, one thing they have fallen into a bit is called reverse power creep. Reverse power creep is the term for when new characters are less powerful than the older ones, which is very clearly a trend in Genshin. Several of the 4-star characters who were available on release remain among the most powerful characters in the game. Bennett, Xiangling, and Xingqiu in particular are still core to many of the strongest teams in the game, plus Sucrose and Fischl have similar longevity. So far, the best 4-star characters who have been released since then tend to be limited to a smaller niche or lack some of the quirks which makes that group of original characters so powerful. Some of this is likely due to unintended consequences. Xiangling's Pyronado has no ICD, can snapshot buffs, as well as having long off-field duration, and I suspect it's unlikely Hoyo really understood how overpowered these small facts would be. Subsequent characters seem much more finely tuned in terms of how their abilities interact with the underlying logic of the elemental system, so it seems likely Xiangling will continue to be unmatched, perhaps until they release a 5-star equivalent. Bennett's buff stands out as being extremely powerful, while also being useful to majority of characters. This contrasts with the support characters who have been released since, whose buffs tend to either be weaker than Bennett's if they're as general purpose as his, or similarly strong but much more focused on one specific niche. Even Shenhe, a 5-star character, follows this pattern. Her buff is potentially more powerful than Bennett's, but she's locked into her small niche and sees much smaller usage as a result. Genshin's battle system is more complicated than most, and Hoyo will have learned a ton from how players have used characters since launch, giving them much more control over the relative power levels of newer characters. However, I don't think the reverse power creep is necessarily a bad thing. The main downside is that it could discourage people from building newer characters, since they would not have the pressure of needing to in order to keep up. While this may be a factor for some people, I'm personally not motivated by meta. What I want from Genshin's combat is variety. I love trying unique and unusual teams, exploring how different characters' kits interact with one another, and discovering unexpected synergies. This approach taken so far has mostly catered to my preferences. New characters are focused on bringing novelty rather than higher numbers, and it absolutely keeps me interested. I do still like to complete the hardest content, and I do find it a little sad when some new character I like using in the overworld is just outclassed by the usual suspects. I'm much happier when new characters are like Yunjin, who is a viable replacement for Bennett in specific situations, than characters like Candace, who has a fun playstyle which just does not compete. Or worse, Kaveh, whose most viable teams are centered around actively avoiding triggering his intended mechanics. Of course, any character is viable with enough investment and skill, but for those of us who would prefer to have many good characters rather than a small number who have been hyper invested into, balance is definitely important. A middle road of making new characters' strength be roughly equivalent to the older ones but more focused on a smaller niche would be the sweet spot for keeping at least me happy in the long run. So what can we expect in the future? At its core, the driving force for this will be how Genshin's revenue changes over time, how important it is to Hoyo, and how the community reacts to the characters released. In Genshin, the combination of characters is often more important than raw power of each individual member in the team, and the mechanics of the game do tend to favor flexibility and support utility more than raw power, all of which should hopefully make it less likely that Hoyo will walk down the path of introducing power creep. Hoyo have been focused more on targeting new niches, since that makes the game more varied without making older characters obsolete, so unless the finances change drastically or the community changes its tune a ton, I think we'll continue to see that be their main approach. Thanks to the complexity of Genshin's real-time combat, they have a lot of tools at their disposal for tuning new characters and adjusting synergy to keep things balanced, which seems to be getting more use over time. The downside to this is potential for characters like Dea, who was intended to introduce a new role which seems to just not have worked in practice. There's always the hope that such missteps can be solved by a new artifact set or new gameplay features though. Overall, as long as Genshin's popularity doesn't suddenly nosedive, I fully expect to see new characters continue to follow the same pattern. The current player base largely appreciates the flexibility that the approach so far has provided, and while new characters are often doom-posted at first, more often than not they're well received in the end. Assuming they keep to the same approach, we should see more new niches filled, more potential teams unlocked, and more variety in gameplay. Most new characters will at best be comparable to the OG ones in terms of strength, but be more focused on a smaller niche. A few will be disappointingly weak, while one or two will be unexpectedly powerful. They'll keep experimenting with new roles and new mechanics, which will be a little hit or miss, and new artifact sets and weapons which will also become more varied over time. I'm expecting Neuvillette to just be one of those few who stand out, rather than a sign of things to come. If that turns out to be the case, then I'll be a very happy dinosaur. And please, Hoyo, give us some more interesting endgame content which isn't just a plain old DPS check. Until next time!